Welcome to Global Forum, a platform for discussion of global issues from global perspectives. Today's topic is a very important one that concerns the very medium that we are using itself, and that will be the notion of new frontiers of communication involving internet, television, telephone, and other technologies, and how that's impacting the human society. This is first of a series of discussions, and we promise we'll bring people from all over the world to participate in these panel discussions as we go along. Today we have two very distinguished guests here. My first guest is Professor Grant Kien. He is a professor specializing in media studies, globalization and culture. All three topics tie in very well with the discussion we want to have today. Next is my other learned colleague, Professor Valerie Smith, and she specializes in interpersonal communication, intercultural communication, and conflict communication. I welcome you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now let's start with talking about a book that you may not necessarily like very much, Professor Kien. That is Alvin Toffler's two books. That is Third Wave and his recent book, Power Shift. How do you look at the notion of third wave, where he says humanity now has entered an entirely new mode of communication, where all five major spheres, including technosphere, infosphere, sociosphere, political sphere, have changed, and success in each requires totally different skills and totally different techniques. What's your reflection on that conception?
Well, I actually had the pleasure of hearing Alvin Toffler speak at some point, and he thankfully has a good sense of humor about his own predictive powers, and is very, I think, reflective on his own position. That said, I think that he is making a point with an agenda, and I think that there's a lot of meat to what he's saying. At the same time, is always the other side to technology, and I think one of the popular reactions to technology is to fall into the techno-determinist position and just see technology as driving us forward. I like to try to balance that out by considering what the socio-cultural implications are in the uptake of technology. So while technology does enable us to do quite a number of things that we envision doing and fulfills our, I suppose, communicative evolutionary drive, at the same time, culture and society play a huge role in determining what uses we will put our technologies to. And I think that, especially in terms of the present situation, the rapid development of digital technology in the latter part of the 20th century and our current circumstances led to a lot of perhaps misunderstandings about how technology actually comes into play. The internet, for example, arose through a very programmatic developmental process, then went through a phase where it was very much like a Wild West frontier. And I think at present what we're seeing now is the social, cultural, and as a result legal manifestation or influence, I suppose, on the use of this technology. So for some time, I think we were prone to a bit of hyperbole about the potentiality of this technology. And what we're starting to see now is actually a more, I suppose, systemic response to it, in which we're making very important cultural and social and political decisions about what we're really going to allow this technology to do.
You set the agenda for us very well. Let's go to our colleague here. One of the points that our colleague Grant Kien made was whether or not technology has a transformative power, whether or not we can think of techno-determinism, you know. And even Heidegger says in his book on technology is highly transformative. He says the difference between old technology and new technology is old technology was instrumental, only extension of human capabilities, and new technology is a ready reserve and also a source of transformation. It transformed its own originator, its own propagator. What's your take on this?
Well, similar to my colleague here, I am also not a strong technological determinist in that I don't think...
Does it mean you're a mild technological determinist?
It means I'm in the middle. I do think technology affects communication and it affects relationships, but it's not the only factor that affects communication and relationships. There are social factors and cultural factors. And I think if we look back through history to older types of communication that are still existing today, and then bring it up to the time of the internet, that helps to give us the context for such a discussion. We've had some scholars say 4, some scholars say 5 eras of communication. And the first, of course, is pre-literate or oral societies. And this is where the technology of writing had not yet been introduced. Characteristics of communication in those societies, and we still have societies like that today, but characteristics of communication include communication being immediate, face-to-face, include communication being poetic in many ways. If you look at, if you grew up in the United States, for example, and someone said, row, row, row your boat, if you haven't heard that song for 20 or 30 years, you can finish the rest gently down the stream because it has that rhyme and poetry that helps us to remember it. And so before writing, we had many techniques that were repetitious and that the elders in the tribe told the community the stories and passed on the oral tradition. And communication it was situational. It was in the setting of being, having all the factors of nonverbal communication and emotion being expressed through the face, especially in the eye contact and as well as the gestures and all of these aspects. And yet communication changes when you introduce the technology of writing. And so it does help to determine communication. It helps to communicate, determine the effects in some ways. For example, with writing, putting ideas down on words, we're losing that face-to-face, we're losing that immediacy, but at the same time, we're gaining the power to, some say, to have abstract thinking, because we can put things down and we don't have to occupy our mind to remember that part anymore when it's down on paper. And then we can develop the next thought and the next thought and the next thought to have that abstract thinking and complex ideas and theories instead of the repetition of the stories and so forth. And so that's one example of, when ownership of ideas comes into play. And then,
may I interrupt you, remind you? Ultimately, what I want to know from you is, can technology transform people and its own creators? These are all good examples of previous technologies. Is modern technology in any position to transform its own creators beyond what they had intended it to do? And the best example that Torf Toffler gives, I think, is that of a machine which he says stored of human labor. And then he says, now we're in the era of computer which is stored of intelligence. And he said, imagine a situation, you are at work, and you'll get a call, the call is coming from your computer, home computer calls you, and says, I read the news today for weather, and discovered 3 leaks in the roof. I have called 3 people who will fix it. Here are the 3 invoices. You order me one, you can authorize one, and I'll get it fixed before you get home. That's a totally different kind of interaction between technology and person. Is that possible, and what's the consequence of that if that happens?
Yeah, I think there's positive and there's negative consequences. Definitely the positive consequences. It can simplify and make our lives easier. It can help us avoid difficult, and we're like seamlessly integrated with knowledge at our fingertips, immediately that we need to make decisions.
But those are all examples of technology and its instrumentality, expansion of our capabilities, expansion of our memory function. But does it go beyond that, I'm asking you?
Well, as a you brought up Heidegger, and of course, I mean, I've published on Heidegger.